first, number one, since the Korea Foundation Forum was launched 3 years ago, only in 2008, it's for the first time we're having Korea Foundation south of Han River, the so-called Gangnam area. Second, well, I think, again for the first time in 3-year history of Korea Foundation, I think today we have the largest number of audiences. And I should say that actually we invited as distinguished speaker Dr. John Henry last year. And that was actually we recorded the highest, largest number of audiences too. So I think he always carrying his own fans. And today, well, I think again, Dr. Henry and his colleagues, Dr. Cha, Victor, and Michael Green, again, they broke the number record. The second, how we will proceed today. From now until 8 o'clock, the breakfast meal will be served. And then 8 o'clock sharp, I'll be back here. We're going to start today's main event with welcoming remarks by Vice President of the Korea Foundation, Ambassador Han Young-hee, which will be followed by main speeches. Dr. Henry will give approximately 10-minute brief speech about the U.S. China policy, and then Victor will give another 10-minute speech about U.S. policy toward North Korea and of course, I hope North-South Korean relations. And Michael Green, Dr. Green, will take turns, and he is going to again another 10-minute speech on U.S. policy toward Japan. So altogether, approximately half an hour speeches by 3 distinguished speakers, and then we're going to have the remaining time assigned to free open floor Q&A session. Thank you very much. Enjoy the meal, although it's very humble. I'll be back on 8 o'clock sharp. Thank you. This is actually another quote-unquote for the first time in 3-year history of Korea Foundation. We had a steak. This is unprecedented. And I should say that this is not on purpose. Well, actually, the hotel, the Marriott Hotel, having known that so many distinguished speakers and audiences gathering this morning, they just voluntarily upgraded to steak. Really appreciate that. Okay, since the Dr. Kim Byung-wook, the president of the Korea Foundation, is unfortunately out of country now, and is business trip to Canada and then the United States. So we have on his behalf, on behalf of the Korea Foundation, we have Vice President of the Foundation, Ambassador Han Young-hee. So it's my great pleasure to present Ambassador Han Young-hee, Vice President of the Korea Foundation, to the podium for his warm welcoming remarks. Thank you. Would you please join me?
President of CSIS, Dr. John Henry, CSIS Korea Chair, Dr. Victor Cha, CSIS Japan Chair, Dr. Michael Green, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Korea Foundation, I would like to sincerely thank all the participants for joining us this morning. And I am pleased to see many friends of the Korea Foundation, important scholars, and members of the diplomatic and the policy-making community in Korea here today. It gives me a particular pleasure and honor to welcome 3 of the most distinguished and busiest foreign policy experts in Washington, D.C. President and the CEO of CSIS, Dr. John Henry, CSIS Korea Chair, Dr. Victor Cha, and CSIS Japan Chair, Dr. Michael Green, as our special speakers today. CSIS has been our important long-time partner in the United States for 20 years now. For those who don't know, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Korea Foundation. Since the early 1990s, we have been working closely with the CSIS to promote great awareness and understanding of political, economic, and security issues of Korea in the United States and other parts of the globe. In 2009, our long-time partnership bore fruit with the establishment of the Korea chair of the CSIS. Korea Foundation, together with our partners in Korea, as well as the United States, supported the establishment of the Korea chair, which has proven to be one of the successful achievements of the Korea Foundation in the field in recent years. As many of you know, Dr. Victor Cha has made the Korea chair so successful with remarkable achievements in such a short period of time. And it comes to Korea, the CSIS Korea chair has become an indispensable feature on the Washington political landscape. I would like to take this opportunity to thank him for his excellent intellectual leadership. I believe all of you here already know our speakers' outstanding accomplishments. Their bios are in the material that was handed out to you on Friday. So, I won't go through the details, but we'll mention just a few highlights of their career. In Washington, D.C., President Kennedy is known as one of the very few who has deep experience and knowledge about national security budgeting, as well as having influence on capital bills. Although he is at CSIS now, he is still working closely with the government as chairman of the Defense Policy Board of the U.S. Department of Defense. Dr. Cha, the current Korea chair at CSIS, was the director for Asian Affairs of the National Security Council at the White House, and is currently teaching at Georgetown University as well. Dr. Green is leading the Japan chair at CSIS and also teaching at Georgetown University. Prior to joining CSIS, he served as special assistant to the U.S. President for National Security Affairs and was senior director for Asian Affairs of the National Security Council. Today, our speakers will talk about U.S. policy in Asia. Now that the Obama administration has passed the halfway mark of this term, I believe it will be a good opportunity to assess this Asia policy thus far and how the United States will work with its key enemies like Korea and Japan to handle the challenges in this region for the rest of its term. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and pleasure for me to present President and CEO of CSIS, Dr. John Kennedy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's pretty startling to see such a big audience. I will tell you, if we do a lot of conferences in Washington, but I couldn't dare hold a conference at 8 o'clock in the morning and expect this kind of a turnout. I would be fairly embarrassed if I tried to do that. And so I think it's a testament not only to the importance of the Korea Foundation. Korea Foundation has made a major mark on Korea and, of course, internationally. But also it's a testament to the intellectual vibrancy of Korea. And it's one of the things that I always marvel at. I come here, every time I come to Korea, there's a crisis. You guys have the corner on having crisis. I mean, and of course, it's a testament to the strength of the culture and the vibrancy of this democracy that you have these perpetual crises and that everything is strong. It's really wonderful. So I'm grateful to have a chance to be here. I would like to just say a few words about America's changing perception of the rise of China and how it's shaping how we're thinking about Asia going forward. And I'll try to be brief because the two experts, Victor Shah and Mike Green, you really came to hear them, not to hear me. So I'm going to get out of the way. But let me say just a few words, if I may, about our relations with China and how we think it's reshaping this landscape. When President Obama came into office 2 years ago, he inherited a very good framework from the Bush administration on Asian policy. We had good, constructive relations with China, and we had wonderfully blossoming relations here in Korea, and some turmoil in Japan, which were still the final stages, I think, of that, but largely a very good framework. But then during the first 2 years, there have been a series of developments which frankly have caused us to be concerned. You all know them well. But we've had a series of security episodes in the South China Sea where regular and irregular Chinese maritime forces have confronted American ships. We have seen tense relations in the South China Sea with other ASEAN countries. We have had a Chinese fishing vessel that operated quite provocatively around Senkaku Islands and created a great controversy with Japan. I was last here 2 weeks after the Cheonan was attacked and destroyed by North Korean forces. And of course, since that time, North Korea then, with what I consider to be a criminal act, attacked the Lungkyang Island. So we've seen 2 acts of war during the last year. And in both instances, I hate to say it, but China treated them almost as though they were industrial accidents. Didn't really recognize the significance of these acts. And then we've seen that China in recent weeks has been clamping down very seriously on democracy elements inside its own country. Now we ask ourselves, what do we make of this? Are we seeing an anomaly? Because the rise of China has been the rise of a peaceful giant. But these last 2 years have not been evidence of a peaceful giant. And the question is, what does that mean? Why is this happening? And is it a long-term phenomenon or is it a short-term phenomenon? I think it's our view, this is a complex question, but I think it's our view that this is a long-term phenomenon. I think it grows out of what is becoming a much more complicated and dynamic Chinese society. A society and an economy and a leadership structure that is far too dynamic to be managed in the old ways that were managed by a central, non-transparent, authoritarian party. And this complexity is going to be a reality for all of us for, I think, at least the next 15 years. Now, what does that mean for us? First, I don't think it changes fundamentally our approach, the American approach to deal with China, which is to engage China in every way we can. We want China to become a normal partner in the international system. China still has to decide what leadership role it's willing to play in the international system, but we want it to be more engaged. I think that's the first thing. Second thing is we need to reinforce the fundamentals. Our grand strategy involved 2 things. Engaging China, but stabilizing the region through bipartisan partnerships with key states in the region. And of course, Korea is at the center of that. Our security partnership with Korea is fundamental to the security of all of East Asia. And same thing we would say with our security partnership with Japan. And this is not a threatening statement to our friends in China, but it is a reassuring statement to all of our friends in Asia. America does see its continuing responsibility to be a security partner, with Korea, with Japan, and other countries that are simply looking for a peaceful, open, transparent system of states in Asia. I think that remains the case. Now, I would say that we're grateful for the strengthening and deepening ties that we have with Korea. General Kim, I want to thank you for your leadership when you were in office. This has become a much stronger partnership. I think we have a period of time now when we have set aside the immediate deadline of OPCON transfer, and we need to make this a time where we work out in detail with each other how we're going to partner as equal military partners. We'll do that. We also should be encouraging stronger, closer ties between Japan, Korea, and the United States. I know this is difficult, and I know the enormous generosity that Koreans expended for Japan after the tragedies in Japan, and the deep disappointment that was felt here about the textbook issue. I understand that. And this is a problem we have to overcome. We're going to have to deal with that. But in the long run, our security interests fundamentally call us to work closely together, and that ought to be a priority despite the tension that we have with each other. Finally, let me say that we should not be insecure about our future. We should be very confident about our future. There's no question how this is going to end up. Korea at some point will be united and free following the leadership of South Korea throughout the peninsula. That will happen. We don't know the time. We should not be intimidated by it, and we should not be afraid of it. And we shouldn't be worried about the fears or the anxieties of neighbors that are indeed threatened by it. This is not for us to worry about. We should simply move forward to make this success a reality and not be afraid. Thank you very much.
John, is this your iPad?
No, that's
Somebody else's? Okay.
You can have that.
Well, I too want to first thank the Korea Foundation for graciously hosting this event. As Dr. Henry said, I mean, the work that you've done in the United States and around the world has really been phenomenal, and congratulate you on this special anniversary for the foundation. I also want to recognize General Kim as well for all of the work he did through very difficult times last year with the aggressions by the North Koreans. My role today is to talk about the U.S. policy towards Korea. And I'll start first by saying a little bit about where I think we are on North Korea, and then say a bit about a little bit about the current state of the U.S.-ROK alliance. On North Korea, I think it's fairly clear that the Obama administration came into office quite interested and very forward-looking in terms of trying to push the negotiation agenda with North Korea. They had picked up on elements of the six-party agreements that the previous administration had worked on, that Michael Green and I had worked on. And they wanted to move forward with those and really try to implement the 2005 joint statement. As we all know, the administration was really pushed back by missile tests in April of 2009, and then the second nuclear test, the revelations about UEP, the Cheonan sinking, and then the Yongpyeong-do shelling, which had moved the administration in the direction of a policy they now call strategic patience. This is essentially a policy that aims to allow the North Koreans to feel the brunt of responsibility for their misbehavior, and at the same time try to pre-position a future negotiation such that if they were to return to talks, they would be along the terms of what the United States and its allies want, and not along the terms of what North Korea wants. I think this is a smart policy, and I think it's also fairly clear that really, probably for the first time in quite some time, U.S. policy is in many ways wedded very tightly to that of South Korea. If you talk to any U.S. official, they will tell you that South Korea in many ways has the lead on this, and that people would like to see North-South dialogue and apology for the Cheonan sinking. as well as some bilateral discussions between the North and the South on other issues, including denuclearization. We've been having a series of meetings here, Dr. Hamre and Michael Green and myself, with officials, and it's fairly clear what the road forward is. I mean, people would like to see a UN Security Council resolution declaring North Korea's uranium enrichment in violation of standing agreements. They'd like to see a declared moratorium on further progress by the North in its nuclear programs, followed by international inspections. But the big obstacle to all this is China. China is not willing to sign on to a UN Security Council resolution. And I think, in many ways, China's decision to really support the North is not so much out of a tight communist brotherly relationship with the North. It is somewhat about concerned instability in the North. I think they're certainly concerned about that. But I think it really is a relationship that has become very much tied to China's domestic development in its northeastern provinces. I think in many ways China's North Korea policy today is a domestic policy more than it is a foreign policy. And in particular, one that's very focused on economic predation, really trying to suck as much resources out of the North for their northeastern provinces as they can. This really started from 2007, when the North agreed to a joint venture in the Musan iron mines, as well as the Daesan copper mines. If we look, I mean, in 2003, the North was only exporting $15 million worth of mineral exports to China. Only 5 years later, it's now over $215 million. Of the top 10 exports to China this year, last year in 2010, they're all in copper. So there clearly is a strategy aimed in this direction. I should say that I don't think the North Koreans do this because they love China. I think they do not like this relationship. They feel like they are treated like a core province of the North. And I don't think China likes it either, in the sense that they are forced to countenance a lot of North Korean bad behavior because they want these economic agreements to go forward. So in many ways, China and North Korea are mutual hostages. The Chinese don't want the North to collapse, so they countenance the bad behavior. The North doesn't like being exploited as a poor province, yet at the same time it needs the help from China, which is the only country in the world that is helping them today. In terms of the U.S.-ROK relationship, I think it is fairly safe to say that the Obama administration has really seen the high watermark in U.S.-ROK relations in the past 2.5 years. All of us are very familiar with the relationship between Barack Obama and Lee Myung-bak, a very close personal relationship, a unique relationship, I think, in international relations today that I think is the envy of many countries who seek such a relationship with the United States. Korea is not just only an ally in the region, it has really tried to fulfill its role as a global ally, working with the United States on different agendas, including climate change, counterproliferation, development assistance around the world. And I think what is really distinct about the relationship today when we talk to officials, as we have done both here in Seoul and in the United States, there really is, I know it's a very difficult, intangible thing, but there really is a sense or a feeling of trust in this relationship that I have not seen for quite some time. And that is a very refreshing thing to see in this relationship. I would completely agree with John's remark about how this is a very key alliance for the United States and Asia. A linchpin, or maybe one of the linchpins in Asia today for the United States. And I think it's fairly safe to say that when the United States looks around the world at key partners it wants to work with on different agendas, that Korea is one of the first to come to mind. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I think that I'll leave it at that for now and be happy to take any questions about Carter or any of this other stuff in the Q&A. So thank you again this morning for coming, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with Victor Cha and Dr. Hamrick. When I left the National Security Council and came to the Center for Strategic and International Studies in 2006, there was a Japan chair and a China chair. Today we have, as you've heard, a very influential and dynamic Korea chair. We now have an India chair, and we're moving toward the Southeast Asia chair. So I tell my academic colleagues, when you study East Asia community, you need to go to Washington and CSIS, because we're moving quickly to establish the community on the Potomac River. At the NSC, I had responsibility, among other things, for writing our strategy towards the Asia Pacific, or as we called it in the Bush administration, our strategery. And in many ways, we didn't depart from the broad contours set by the Clinton administration. After the end of the Cold War, the Clinton administration took some time to decide what its foreign policy should be in Asia. The Soviet Union gave us simple clarity. But by 1995-96, the basic approach became what Joe Nye calls engaging China, but balancing China with our key allies and partners in the region. And the Bush administration picked up on that. And to be very candid, the broad view between 2001 and 2005 was that Japan was going to be a constant. The President Bush had a particularly close relationship with Prime Minister Koizumi. He was the closest friend he had in Asia, one of his closest friends in the world. And many people questioned whether the Korea alliance was a variable, an uncertainty. Because the election of Roh Moo-hyun created a lot of drama, there were the candlelight protests against US forces and so forth. I often made the argument that the US-Korea alliance was like what the American humorist Mark Twain said about the music of Richard Wagner. He said that it's actually much better than it sounds. There was a lot of noise and a lot of newspaper headlines about friction between Washington and Seoul. And there were some misunderstandings, frankly, about the US-Korea alliance, particularly in Beijing, where senior officials would describe the strategic framework in Asia, and without being self-conscious about it, would tell us that the US-Korea alliance is somewhat uncertain. But at the end of the Roh Moo-hyun period, we actually had one of the most productive periods in the history of the alliance. Korea-US FTA, relocation of US forces to Kongtaek, and of course Korea's contributions in Iraq and Afghanistan, the largest contingent in Iraq after the US and Britain. Incredible productivity in this alliance, in spite of a lot of sparks and drama. And the minority of people in Washington at the time, who were projecting out from the early difficulties between the US and Korea when the Roh Moo-hyun government came into power, those who projected outward made a huge mistake, thinking that this difficulty was the future of the US-Korea alliance. And in fact, as you've heard from both previous speakers, not only did the Roh Moo-hyun administration end with a much stronger alliance, but today, Kim Young-bak and President Obama have one of the closest personal relationships, and our alliance is one of the closest alliances we have in the world. So now you hear people argue that perhaps Korea is the constant and Japan's the variable, and some questions about the future of Japan as an ally. This, I think, is as mistaken as the arguments 6 years ago about the future of the US-Korea alliance. But you can understand in some ways why some people would be questioning the alliance right now. The first sort of shock to the system was the election of the Democratic Party of Japan in 2009. And a number of commentators in both Japan and the US predicted that this would be a radically different alliance now. Japan would be more independent, would counterbalance the US and Asia, and failed to take a close look at the actual election and the actual debate. The exit polls in Japan after this election were very clear. The Japanese people were not voting for a change in foreign policy or a change in the US-Japan alliance. The polls taken before the DPJ won had 76% of the Japanese supporting the alliance with the US. The DPJ had one mandate, and basically one mandate only, and that was to get rid of the Liberal Democratic Party, which they did quite successfully, at least at first. Within about a year, Prime Minister Hatoyama was doing away with some of the rhetoric that he started out with, promising to counterbalance the US with the East Asia community and so on and so forth. And when Prime Minister Khan came in, his foreign policy strategy was actually quite well received in Washington, was considered quite promising. But then Japan got hit by another shock, and a very tragic one, which was the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis of March 11th. And again, you've heard people say, can Japan recover? Is Japan's power sufficient? And you even hear senior US officials worrying publicly about the effect on Japan. But I think that history and even the recent few months demonstrate several things. One is that Japan is completely capable of not only recovering but growing stronger after this crisis, and also that the Obama administration is not making any changes in the fundamental approach that Clinton, Bush, and now President Obama have had, which is to focus on our key allies, including Japan, as the linchpins of our forward diplomacy and engagement in Asia. The earthquake and tsunami are not new. Japan suffered enormous damage in Kobe in 1995, in the Kanto Plain in 1923. When you look at the macroeconomic growth figures, on a year-by-year basis, you cannot find where the earthquake was because the recovery was so quick. The estimates are $300 billion plus in damage, but the IMF, World Bank, and others expect Japan's going to get back on track. There have been interruptions in production lines, production networks, but they're temporary, and there's no evidence that international corporations are distributing or relocating their supplies away from Japan for the long run. Japan's public has ample savings, and polls show people are willing to pay more taxes and buy bonds. I think out of this, you may see a new style of Japanese political leadership. Prime Minister Khan is suffering with 20% support in the polls. And he will probably be, in my view, in office for some time to come for a variety of reasons, months, maybe years. But I think this crisis has galvanized for a younger generation of politicians in the 40s and 50s a real sense of purpose and a real sense of drive. I think you will see out of this tragedy some serious, realistic thinking about how to strengthen not only alliance with the United States, but also relations with key partners in Asia, including Korea. It's known in Washington and of course in Japan that Korea and Koreans gave generously. The Korean Red Cross raised more money for this tragedy than anything in the history of that organization. The textbook issues and so forth are a perennial problem and will not go away easily. But my sense is that out of the past few years, the difficulty with North Korea, the difficulty with China, and the bonding from this tragedy, that despite these difficulties, US, Japan, Korea, but more importantly in some ways, Japan-Korea ties are going to grow stronger. That is, to conclude, absolutely in US strategic interests. The US, after the Cold War, did not want, actually, a collective security arrangement between Japan and Korea. It preferred to manage these alliances in separate tracks for strategic reasons. But increasingly, with the fluidity in Northeast Asia security dynamics, a stronger Japan-Korea tie and trilateral US-Japan-Korea cooperation is absolutely in US interests. And I think it's in the interest of stability in Asia as a whole. Beijing will not like it, that is a given. And the key for all of our diplomacy is to explain to our Chinese friends that all of us seek closer and deeper ties with China, and that these kinds of groupings are not necessarily zero-sum, that we're all working towards an open, inclusive, and stable regional order. And the key word is inclusive. And that when the US, Japan, and Korea work closely together, it stabilizes the environment, and at the end of the day makes an inclusive regional and trans-Pacific integration more likely, not less likely. And so with that, I thank you and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Three speakers brought us slowly but steadily to the conclusion that maybe in the area there is room for regionalism in a way or another. Is there any chance to provide a grant on this door or this aim from the side of the safety, nuclear safety, safety in general in front of big disaster and catastrophes, is a way for encompassing more countries together. At the same time, how do we face the contemporary phenomena of the local politics in the country, as Dr. Richard Charles said concerning China?
I think the tragedy at Fukushima is actually not. There are about 405 nuclear reactors in the world today. There are, we think, going to be another 300 that will be built over the next 25 years. We need, every one of us, all of our countries that have nuclear power are affected if there are problems in another country. We need to be developing global standards for nuclear safety operations, etc. Today we don't have global standards, and we do need to use this as an opportunity to promote them. Now, I would specifically say that here in Korea, I think Korea has an enormous role to play and an opportunity to play, because Korea has a very robust nuclear industry and wants to become a global vendor to the world for nuclear power. It too should welcome the opportunity to create global norms and standards for both construction and safe operation of nuclear power plants. So we should look at this terrible event not as a crisis for which there's no future, but actually as an opportunity to design a global standard of operations that's transparent and open for everyone. We will depend on that because as nuclear power gets extended around the world, we will want to have those standards in other countries. So I think it's an opportunity.
A small coda to Dr. Henry's point. Of course, next year is the nuclear summit in Korea, so there's an opportunity to begin putting some meat on the bones. In terms of regionalism, we've done a survey at CSIS, you can find on our website, of elites in 9 countries in Asia. And what becomes clear is that there's great enthusiasm for creating an East Asia community and regional institutions, but not so much consensus about what they should look like. And so the institutional architecture in this region, we concluded, will be very fluid. It will be cooperative and competitive at the same time. In that mix, there will be some things the United States will not be in, like the Japan, China, Korea trilateral, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and there will be some things that China's not in, US, Japan, Korea trilaterals. But these are not necessarily creating a division within Asia. It's actually quite a fluid situation, and in some ways, the competition to cooperate can be a little bit like the concept of trade liberalization. When you have competing FTAs, the effect is to cause all countries to want to lower their barriers to trade so they can get in. And I don't think we're in a zero-sum competition in institutional architecture. I think that the growth of these unilateral groupings and cooperative groupings actually increases the pressure on everyone to be more transparent and open and cooperative.
Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. And we all agree that one of the main priorities of the six-part talks and all the diplomatic mobilization here in East Asia is towards the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. And for this, the fundamental question is to make North Korea abandon its nuclear weapon. But some analysts say that in view of what has been happening in other places, such as Libya and Iraq, that North Korea would be even more reluctant to abandon its nuclear arsenal because then it will not have a credible deterrent. So how do you think that they would be convinced otherwise?
The way you frame the challenge is exactly right. That even as we were working on these agreements, the last set of agreements, coming out of six-party talks from 2005, 2007, there was still a great deal of skepticism about whether North Korea truly had made a so-called strategic decision to negotiate away its weapons in return for acceptance in the international community, assistance, peace treaty, all of these sorts of things. I think if we were to ever to return to these talks, the level of skepticism would not just be palpable, it would be exponentially higher, given where we've been since 2007. Does that mean that we should just not negotiate at all? I don't know. I mean, I think that the other problem is that if you have no negotiations, you have a runaway nuclear program, which is basically what we have today. That doesn't mean the United States and others should just jump in to negotiations as though they were trying to put out a fire and therefore be completely subject to all sorts of North Korean bargaining leverage. So this is why I think the administration thus far has taken a very disciplined approach to this and talking about strategic patience. They really want to try to position things in such a way that when they do come back, they are negotiating on their terms and not the North Koreans' terms. And I think that's a pretty smart policy right there.
Ambassador, I think the part of the thrust of your question was when President Bush declared an axis of evil and we overthrew Iraq and we decided to negotiate with North Korea, it created an incentive to have nuclear weapons. And of course that was a conundrum. But having nuclear weapons may give a regime survival, but it will never give a regime prosperity. It's, North Korea and Iran, honestly, have taken approaches that have caused themselves to be isolated from the global community. And that isolation is a product of their behavior. It's not a product of having nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons will never make them welcome states in the international system. I mean, the United States is actively trying to lower its inventory of nuclear weapons. We want fewer. And so a country that chooses to have nuclear weapons, it may give them a guarantee of survival. It does not give them a guarantee of prosperity. And I think that's the confusion. If North Korea faces a choice, it can have this desperate, poor, hopeless future if it stays on the course it's on. Or it can abandon that. And obviously they're looking for a guarantee of survival. But they can abandon it for a future of prosperity. But it's their choice. So far they have chosen to take an obstreperous and difficult course and have attacked innocent South Koreans in some bizarre, stupid exercise of power. And that's not a future.
Yeah, I'm referring exactly to this point. And how do you convince North Korea, the current regime of North Korea, that is abandoning nuclear?
I mean, it seems to me it starts with the North Korean regime acknowledging that their forces attacked South Korea and take some responsibility for that. I mean, that has to be the starting point. There is no other starting point. If it begins that way, then we have a future path we can talk. But right now, it's just an absolute refusal to even acknowledge what happened. And that's obviously a dead end with us. It does not move when that's the starting point. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's how we view it.
The first North Korean nuclear crisis over the Yongbyon reactor began when North Korea unilaterally began producing plutonium after the George Herbert Walker Bush administration pledged to pull all tactical nuclear weapons out of East Asia and commenced an unprecedented dialogue between the Undersecretary of State and Kang Suk-ju, the Vice Foreign Minister of North Korea. The second nuclear crisis over uranium enrichment began when North Korea began procuring centrifuges and starting their uranium enrichment program in violation of all previous agreements. After the Clinton administration signed the agreed framework with North Korea, pledging to improve relations and provide light water reactors. So if there's a correlation between American assurances and North Korean nuclear weapons program, the correlation would be North Korea intensifies its nuclear weapons program when we provide assurances. On the other hand, there's also a correlation between when we're tough on North Korea and the nuclear weapons program. So in some ways, the correlations between our actions and North Korea's nuclear behavior are almost irrelevant. They are pursuing nuclear weapons. It is a central goal of survival, and it is frankly very difficult for any of us to convince them that it's not in their interests. That said, as long as there's some chance, the administration here and in Washington and Tokyo or Beijing and Moscow are right to try engagement, but it has to be, as Dr. Henry said, done in a way that doesn't convince the North Koreans they can with impunity use force. And it's particularly important now that the North Korean side doesn't conclude that their nuclear capability gives them a kind of protection to engage in these provocations. If this were a problem that could be solved through security assurances, it would be a much, much easier problem than it really is. I think, alas, it is a hugely complex problem because this is so central to North Korea's, the North Korean regime's definition of its strategy for survival.
The ambassador's point about convincing North Korea. I mean, I think if you look at the negotiating record, I mean, it's really been over 20 years where countries, including the United States and others, have tried to convince North Korea through the promise of various things to give up their weapons. But you know, I mean, all of us having participated in this process and being now scholars on the outside looking back on it, I'm more convinced that convincing North Korea is not the outside world convincing North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. The North Koreans have to convince themselves that prosperity is more important than domestic political control. That's what they have to convince themselves of. And unfortunately, the nature of this regime is such that it still prizes domestic political control over everything else. We all have many friends who are China scholars, and my friends who are China scholars are always optimistic about North Korea and the ability to negotiate with them and reform, because they think, you know, China did reform, so China can do reform, North Korea can do reform. But the big difference, of course, is that you don't have a Deng Xiaoping in North Korea. And also, for China, you know, to get rich is glorious, but for North Korea, that's not the case. I mean, it's still about political control more than it is prosperity. And that's essentially the problem. So I think they need to convince themselves, the leadership, that that is more important to them. And right now, they don't believe that.
My name is Solwante from Gyeongyang Sinmun, Gyeongyang Daily News. Mr. Carter is in North Korea and he seems to be playing some role, so I'd like to hear some official and unofficial position from you scholars. And second, how the Obama administration is assessing the 11 box policy towards North Korea. Mr. Lee seems to be quite principled in demanding North Korea's apology for their sinking of the Cheonan battleship and their bomb shelling of the Yantian incident. So, does the Obama administration evaluate highly the Lee-Box North Korea policy? Thank you.
You can give an official.
I get to give the official CSIS position. Official place. But, you know, I think, first of all, I think President Carter's visit is a private visit. This does not represent the United States government. It was not done at the request of the United States government. This is his personal initiative. I think we remain of the view that North Korea has to come honestly, forthrightly acknowledge what it has done these last 2 years before there's a real starting point. There's just no way around that. President Carter has a different calculus in his own personal frame of reference, and that's his personal view. But the position of the United States government is that North Korea needs to take responsibility for its actions. It has to acknowledge the attack, and it has to start a process of reconciliation and responsibility taking. I think that's where it stands.
Well, I agree. I think that despite what some of the papers intimate about, possible splits between the U.S. and the ROK, in Washington and here in Seoul, talking to officials, there really isn't a split. I think it's pretty clear. Everybody understands that there are two key pieces to this, and that is, as John said, North Korean addressing of these issues. We can't just forget about them. And then some sort of actual commitments on denuclearization. I think it's pretty clear that both Washington and Seoul feel that those are necessary and that there really isn't much space between them. On former President Carter's visit, as we all know, he certainly has a history of visiting North Korea and trying to help promote breakthroughs. I think it is a private visit, and the administration did not ask him to go. Certainly he will come back, I guess, to come here to Seoul today and convey his own impression of how he thinks the North Koreans might be ready for dialogue. But I think the thing I would emphasize today is, while I think everybody appreciates the good intentions of President Carter, we are in a very different position today. Not only in terms of what has happened between the North and South, but also the nature of dialogue. And what I mean by that is, if the North Koreans want to convey messages to anybody about their willingness to talk, there are now plenty of official channels through which they can do that. In the past, there weren't. But now there are plenty of official channels, both inter-Korean and US DPRK, through which they can do that. So this very almost anachronistic method of trying to use former luminaries to convey cryptic messages is really unnecessary today.
Maybe it's better than make it in Korean languages and to let the translator work on that.
All right, thank you very much.
우리가 지금 이제 북한이라든가 또는 공산권하고 우리 그 자유 서방 세계하고 간에 늘 협상이나 할 때 보면은 늘 우리는 국민 여론이라든가 또 국가 간의 협조라든가 이런 문제 때문에 조금 조급하게 일을 끌어가려고 하는 경향이 있고, 그 북한과 같은 나라들은 항상 한 협상의 담당자들이 뭐 장기간, 뭐 10년, 15년씩 그 자리에서 있으면서 그 자기들이 입장을 유지하고 있기 때문에 통상 나중에 가서 보면은 우리가 조금씩 밀려서 결국 그쪽에 유리한 쪽에서 협상을 맺어가는 그런 형태가 될 경우를 많이 볼 수 있습니다. 그래서 이번 같은 경우도 지금 우리가 조금 경향신문에서 질문을 했습니다만, 우리 지금 한국 정부는 북한에서 분명한 사과를 받아야겠다는 그런 입장이고, 또 지금 육자 회담을 끌어가는 입장에서는 또 비록 그런 것이 또 중요하지만은 또 그 핵 문제라든가 미사일 문제라든가 이런 여러 문제를 풀어가기 위해서는 육자 회담을 또 빨리 진행을 시켜야겠다, 이런 두 가지가 이제 충돌이 되는데, 그와 같은 문제에서 어떻게 하면 우리가 이런 국민의 여론이나 이런 것 때문에 시달리면서 5개 정부들이 같이 협조하는 문제가 북한을 어떻게 끌어들이려면은 우리가 어떻게든 이런 협조가 잘 이루어져야 한다고 저는 생각을 합니다. 그런 차원에서 또 우리가 가만히 생각해보면은 북한이라는 나라를 놓고 우리 다른 나라들이 봤을 때 우리가 입장이 훨씬 유리한데, 늘 우리가 불리한 것처럼 생각하고 북한의 입장에 따라가주는 경향이 많이 있습니다. 그래서 이런 거에 대해서 우리가 지금 한미 간의 협조, 또 더 나아가서는 우리 육자회담에 참가하는 5개국 간의 협조가 어떤 식으로 앞으로 이루어져야 할 것인가에 대해서 한번 크게 말씀해 줄 수 있는지 모르겠습니다.
I think you're right, General, that the algorithm for negotiating six-party talks was always to try to get 5-1. And when we were able to get 5-1, that was actually when we made the most progress in terms of agreements. The problem is that I think, as I alluded to in my initial remarks, I just don't think, getting a very important piece of getting 5-1 is the three allies, US, Japan, ROK. I think we can do that. Another very important piece is, of course, China. And I think it is much, much harder today to get cooperation with China than it was in the past. I think when we were doing this in 2005 to 2007, cooperation with China was a very important part of the negotiating process. And I'm afraid to say I think those days are over. For reasons that Dr. Hamry stated, and Mike, I think China really has made its choice in the way they responded to the Cheonan sinking and the Yongkang Island shelling. And even if we were to get back to six-party talks, getting 5-1, I think will be much, much more difficult, because China has basically chosen to take a different path, which is to support this regime through its so-called succession process, such that China is advantaged in the end. And that, unfortunately, is the sad truth. The broader problem, of course, is whenever you do a multilateral negotiation, as I think Jim Kelly once said, it's like herding cats. It's very difficult to get all 5 or 6 on the same side. That is a natural part of a multilateral negotiation, as you know well. But I think we are faced with some additional challenges if we ever get back to that process with regard to China.
I was one of the staffers in the NSC who wrote the memo in 2002, December 2002, on the idea of six-party talks. And as Professor Cha said, our original concept was 5-1, which is how we handled the multinational negotiations with Milosevic in the late 90s. And it was quite successful for that reason. Proved too difficult to do that. In my view, the action right now, the diplomatic action, should not be in the six-party talks. It should be in the Security Council. Because North Korea has violated previous resolutions with its uranium enrichment program, and of course because of Cheonan and Yongkang, but principally because they've clearly violated Security Council resolutions with their uranium enrichment program. France takes over the presidency of the Security Council next month. President Sarkozy has a very clear stance on proliferation. He had that famous quote, "We live in a real world, not a virtual world," which I loved. And I would like to see France, which has exhibited real leadership in Libya and elsewhere, perhaps take another turn at this issue in the Security Council. Because if we don't use the Security Council to create some consequences for North Korea's violations, we're not going to have any success in the six-party talks. And the U.S. And most countries in the Security Council have a menu of things they want to do, and a limited budget. And so we've not spent a lot trying to get resolutions on North Korea in recent years. But I think we should be investing more. China will resist, but Russia may be a little bit more amenable. And I think we should make another effort.
Dr. Henry, any last word?
I agree with what Dr. Cha said, that the six-party framework assumed that we in China saw the world the same way. And it's not clear that we do see it the same way now in Asia. We don't want to have a tense relationship with China. We want to avoid that. It's not going to be in their interest or in our interest to have tense relations. So we don't want it. But they've made a series of choices that now make a six-party framework, I think, impossible. And we just have to recognize we're in a different world today. Maybe we'll get back to it in a couple of years. I hope we do. I hope we do. I'm not confident we will. But I think we ought to just stay very confident in our own relationship with each other. This is a time for three-party talks.